Hi, my name is Neil Odell and I'm a member of the Norwich and Dresden school boards. This presentation will cover the pupil weighting study and what it means for Norwich. So let's dive in. In order to better understand the impact of the weighting study, it's important to understand a bit of the history of education funding in Vermont. From there, I'll discuss the new proposed equalized pupil weights. We'll then cover the legislative efforts that are currently underway, what the Norwich School Board is doing, and then finally, what you can do. Let's get started. In order to understand where we are today and the change that's being proposed in pupil weights, we need to go back in time a little bit to Vermont in the mid to late 90s. Since Vermont's founding, we've had a series of different education funding formulas. In the years just prior to 1997, Vermont, like many states, had a foundation funding formula. The way that this formula worked is that the state set a base property tax rate. It also set a foundation amount. The foundation amount was defined as the amount of money necessary to provide a minimally adequate education. For those towns that were unable to raise the foundation amount with the base tax rate, the state would provide grants to get them up to the foundation amount. Let's see an example so that this makes more sense. The fictitious Smallville, Vermont. Smallville is very simple. It has a single school with one student, and the town has only one house valued at $400,000. So, with a base tax rate of $1 per $100 of property value and a grand list of $400,000, Smallville can raise $4,000 per pupil in education spending. The state set the foundation amount at $5,000, so they provide a grant to Smallville of $1,000 per pupil to get their funding up to the base amount. Now, let's take a look at another town in Vermont, a property-rich town called Richtown. Just like Smallville, Richtown has only one school with one student and only one house in town. But the difference is that the house, and therefore the grand list, is much greater, $1 million. But both Richtown and Smallville want to spend the same amount per pupil. They both want to spend $10,000 per student. So for Richtown, with a $1 base tax rate and a grand list value of $1 million, they are able to generate per pupil spending of $10,000 without any assistance from the state. For Smallville, the story is a bit different. With a base tax rate of $1, they're able to raise $4,000 in per pupil spending, and with the foundation grant of $1,000, can get to the $5,000 level. But anything above that is going to require more contribution from taxpayers. In fact, if Smallville wants to spend the same amount per pupil, they're going to need to raise an additional $5,000, which is going to require a tax rate of $2.25. This, in large measure, is what led to the Vermont Supreme Court case of Brigham versus Vermont. So what was Brigham versus Vermont? The Brigham case came about when multiple parties brought suit against the state of Vermont, alleging both distinct and overlapping claims. Two students from the towns of Whiting and Hardwick claimed that the state's method of financing public education deprived them of their right under the Vermont and U.S. constitutions to the same educational opportunities as students who reside in wealthier school districts. In addition, several owners from property-poor towns claimed that the current school financing scheme compels them to contribute more than their just proportion of money to fund education, in violation of the Vermont and U.S. constitutions. And finally, the Brandon and Worcester school districts claimed that the current financing scheme deprived them of the ability to raise sufficient money to provide their students with educational opportunities equal to those afforded to students in wealthier school districts, and compels them to impose disproportionate tax rates in violation of the Vermont and U.S. constitutions. And on February 5th of 1997, the Vermont Supreme Court agreed. In the opening paragraph of their judgment, the Supreme Court said that the current education funding system deprives children of an equal educational opportunity in violation of the Vermont Constitution. A few items that are worth noting about the Supreme Court's decision. They said that it was the state's obligation to provide education to its citizens. Also, that in order to fulfill its constitutional obligation, the state must ensure substantial equality of educational opportunity throughout Vermont. The ruling also noted the state needed to provide equal opportunity, not precisely equal per-pupil spending in all districts. And the Supreme Court also noted that the solution resided with the legislature. The Supreme Court decision included several examples of the inequity that existed in Vermont at the time. This is just one example that was cited in the decision. In 1995, the towns of Stannard and Sherburne, which most folks know as Killington, had almost the exact same per-pupil spending. Yet because of dramatically different grand list values, they had dramatically different tax rates. In fact, the taxes on an $85,000 house in Stannard were $2,040, and in Sherburne, they were just $247. So with the Brigham decision handed down by the Supreme Court by June of that same year, the Vermont legislature had enacted the Equal Educational Opportunity Act, what most folks know and refer to as Act 60. Act 60 addressed the Brigham decision and set up a system where any two towns that vote to spend the same amount per pupil will have the same tax rate. But it also set up a system that tried to balance local control with the state's responsibility for education. It maintained local spending decisions, but moved the responsibility of funding those decisions to the state level. This change included the creation of a statewide education property tax, as well as a state education fund to accept those tax revenues. It also introduced the concept of equalized pupils, acknowledging that it costs more to educate certain categories of students. For the calculation of equalized pupils, the legislature identified weights in the following three categories: grade level weights for students in elementary and secondary grades, an additional weight for economically disadvantaged students, and an additional weight for English language learners. This led us to the funding formula that we know today, one that's based on spending per equalized pupil. I'm going to take just a brief moment to review the formula for tax rate calculation so you get a better understanding of how the equalized pupil count impacts the tax rate. Here in Norwich, we take the Marion Cross budget and add to that the Dresden assessment to get total expenditures. It's important to note that the tax rate in Norwich is dependent on both education spending at Marion Cross and in Dresden. We then subtract out revenues to get to net education spending. We then divide that number by the number of equalized pupils to get our net ed spending per equalized pupil. Next, we divide that by the yield number to give the equalized homestead tax rate. And then finally, we divide that by the common level of appraisal, or CLA, to get our final estimated homestead tax rate. Okay, with that history and tax rate calculation as foundation, we're finally getting to the main topic. What is the pupil weighting study, and what does it mean for Norwich? In 2018, the legislature passed Acts and Resolves 173, which, in part, commissioned a study on the existing pupil weights to determine whether or not they were adequate and equitable, in particular because they dated back to Act 60 of 1997. The study was conducted by researchers from the University of Vermont, Rutgers University, and the American Institutes for Research, and it was issued in December of 2019. The study made various findings, but the two most relevant to the discussion of equalized pupils were that the current weights did not adequately represent the true cost differential, and the current weights did not seem to be based on any scientific analysis of the costs. The report recommended updated weights for poverty, English language learners, and secondary grade levels. It also recommended new weights for small and rural schools and students in middle school. The report generated a lot of interest, and for many schools in Vermont, it highlighted an inequity that they had been living with for decades. Because the weights didn't reflect the true costs, some districts that had significant numbers of English language learners or a significant number of students in poverty found it difficult to raise the money necessary to fund their schools. The underweighted equalized pupil count forced their local tax rates higher, in some cases tripping penalty payments, and in other cases leading to failed budget votes. Despite the interest and the push from many schools, the report didn't lead to any legislative action in 2019 nor in 2020, in part due to the pandemic. At this stage, it's worth pointing out the policy intention of the changed weights. Remember that a town's tax rate is related to their spending per equalized pupil. If you change the equalized pupil count while maintaining the same level of spending, you change the tax rate. So, increasing the equalized pupil count lowers the tax rate. It doesn't generate more money for a community. Let's look at a scenario. For a school with net education spending of $5 million and 300 equalized pupils, their net ed spending per equalized pupil is $16,667. Using this year's estimated property yield and a common level of appraisal of 90%, that town is looking at a tax rate of $1.43. If their equalized pupil count changes to 350 as a result of the new weights, their per pupil spending drops to $14,286, and the resulting tax rate drops to $1.26, a change of 17 cents. This is the policy aspect of this change. Changing the equalized pupil count changes a town's taxing capacity. For those towns that have been historically underweighted, they will now have excess taxing capacity that they can leverage to increase spending in their district without necessarily increasing the tax rate. During the 2021 legislative session, there was a renewed push for the implementation of the recommendations of the weighting study. The legislature passed Act 59, establishing a task force of 3 representatives and 3 senators to recommend an implementation plan for the pupil weighting factors report. The task force met several times over the summer and fall of 2021 and issued a final report on December 17th. The task force made 2 primary recommendations. The first was called pupil weighting, a recommendation to implement the pupil weights with some modifications as was recommended in the original study. The second was called cost equity payments, which would provide school districts with equity payments or grants derived from the new weights. The task force report also provided an analysis of the impact of either approach on school districts throughout the state. I want to pause here for a moment and talk about the numbers that were provided in the task force report. For modeling purposes, the state used budget and education spending numbers from fiscal year 20, which is pre-pandemic. And that's appropriate, noting that spending during the pandemic was abnormal. The other item is that we discovered the tax rate increase estimate for Norwich in the task force report is incorrect. The report indicates that Norwich may see a 32% increase, and I'll note that our one-page handout states that as well, but that calculation is incorrect. The modeled increase is closer to 21%, or going from $1.74 to $2.12. The cost equity payment is likely inflated in the task force report too. And these numbers are still changing. As bills proceed through the legislature and as new scenarios are modeled, we'll likely see tax rate estimates change several times over the next few months. The main point still remains, however. Norwich is likely to see a substantial tax rate increase in the coming years. So what is going on in the legislature at this moment? As of the recording of this video, March 27th, 2022, S. 287 has passed the Senate. As proposed, the new weights would go into effect in fiscal year 24, and implementation would take place over 5 years. The weights would address the same areas as defined in the original weighting study. The bill also proposes the creation of an Education Fund Advisory Committee to monitor the education finance system and recalculate or recalibrate the weights as necessary. Currently, the charge of this committee also contains a provision that they consider transitioning to an income-based funding model. More on that transition to income-based funding in a minute. A little more information on the proposed transition period. For fiscal years 24, 25, and 26, the equalized pupil count is averaged with the prior 4 years. In fiscal year 27, the count is averaged with the prior 3 years, and in fiscal year 28, the count is averaged with the prior 2 years. Throughout the duration of the implementation, the excess spending threshold is suspended. This projection that you see here is a model that was provided to Senate Finance and is based on education spending from fiscal years 16 through 20. This would have been the increase in the Norwich tax rate using the 5-year phased-in approach beginning in FY20. I think what may be more useful is the annual percentage increase in the tax rate rather than the actual projected numbers. We think Norwich could see annual increases between 5 and 8% for several years. So what would this increase look like for you? Well, if we had gone from a tax rate of $1.74 to $2.12, this is what the increase would look like for varying house site values. Again, I want to stress that this is not the increase that you're going to see next year. It's way too soon to be able to tell that. This is a model to give you a sense of the increases that we may see. I mentioned previously that the bill that just passed the Senate includes the creation of a committee that would be responsible for considering a move to a purely income-based funding model for education. There are also 2 additional bills being considered both by House Ways and Means and Senate Finance that would move education funding away from the property tax to an income tax. While there are some legislators that are very interested in advancing this proposal, our analysis is that there is not enough time left in this session to see these bills through to completion. With all of this, you may be wondering what the school board is doing on this matter. A few things, really. We're keeping a close eye on the legislative process and monitoring the progress of the bills related to this. We'll be providing updates at every school board meeting, and we'll also do our best to keep the web page on the SAU site updated. We've been reaching out to our representatives and senators on the potential impact, and Board Chair Tom Candon testified in Senate Finance on February 23rd, alerting that committee to the potential impact in Norwich. And finally, we're also going to be very mindful of the impact on budgeting for next year. And speaking of budgeting, it's important to remember that our total education spending is made up of both the Marion Cross budget, but also the Dresden assessment to Norwich. And it's that Dresden assessment, Norwich's portion of what it costs to run the middle and high school, that makes up just over half of our education spending. So, who determines the Dresden budget that's presented to voters? Well, It's the Dresden School Board. For those of you that are not familiar with the setup, the Dresden School Board consists of the 7 members of the Hanover School Board, plus 4 out of the 5 available Norwich board members. Now, I want to stress that we, Norwich, have a very good collegial relationship with our Hanover colleagues. We all get along very well. What we are worried about is that the New Hampshire education funding system doesn't currently have the same funding and taxation pressures as Norwich and Vermont. The tax rate pressures that we have in Norwich are not going to be felt by voters in New Hampshire. This could be important when we look at a few different scenarios on how we might be able to deal with the potential tax rate increase. The primary thing that we could do in the near term is cut the budget. In Marion Cross, that's pretty straightforward. We'd realize the full savings of any cuts. When looking at the Marion Cross budget, it's important to acknowledge that almost 2/3 of the budget is devoted to salaries and benefits. So if we need to achieve significant savings, it would be difficult to do that without addressing staffing. The other scenario is cutting the Dresden budget. This one may be more difficult for the reasons we just talked about, but there's another issue at play with this approach. Norwich is responsible for approximately 1/3 of the Dresden budget. This means that only 1/3 of any reduction in the Dresden budget is realized in Norwich. To save $1 million in Norwich, we'd need to cut $3 million from the Dresden budget. One other budget scenario is to increase revenue at both MCS and Dresden. Our options in this arena are limited. One significant source of revenue in the past has been tuition students at the high school. Those numbers have declined recently, in part due to Vermont's school consolidation with Act 46. We'll continue to see if there are ways to increase revenue in both Dresden and Norwich. There's another variable that has a big impact on the tax rate, and that's not a part of the weighting study, but it is worth discussing. It's the Common Level of Appraisal, or CLA. If you're not familiar with the CLA, it's a measure designed to adjust the property values based on recent home sales. A declining CLA can really have a dramatic impact on the tax rate. In fact, this year's CLA of 84.39%, almost a 6-point decline from the year before, added 31 cents to the proposed tax rate. If we continue in this direction, it will exacerbate the changes from the new weights. So, what can all of us do? We've bucketed these things into 2 different categories, short-term and long-term. In the short term, stay informed. Be aware that a tax rate increase is very likely, and we encourage you to attend board meetings or visit our website for updates on the legislative process and what is likely to happen in Norwich. If you're concerned about the situation, we urge you to contact your senators and representatives. Their contact information is on our website, and I'll share that link at the end of this presentation. There are a few longer-term options to consider as well. We could address the equalized pupil numbers. There are 4 main categories of weights: poverty, English language learners, rural schools, and small schools. Norwich can't change those last 2 categories. We're not rural nor small. We might be able to change the other 2, however, poverty and English language learners. We could consider providing affordable housing options in Norwich, which would attract a more socioeconomically diverse population. More English language learners in the school would also help, so efforts to attract those populations to Norwich would also be useful. Finally, we could consider growing the grand list and spreading the tax burden over a greater number or a more diverse tax base. The bottom line is that we have some options available to us. We just need to decide which ones we're going to pursue. If you're looking to learn more, we've provided additional resources at this link. There you can find the original weighting study, the report of the task force, and updated information from this legislative session. If you have more questions, please feel free to reach out to the Norwich School Board. Our contact information is available at this same link, and we're always happy to see you at a school board meeting, the first Wednesday of every month at 6:30 p.m. in the Marion Cross Library. Thanks very much for your time.